Good morning, everybody. Thank you for being here. Let me switch gears on our little setup. As Block mentioned, I'm the director of a project called the Children of the Code Project.
Children of what?
Children of the Code. Children of the Code. We're all pretty familiar with the idea of being children of the DNA code, right? But there's another code, and that's the code of our writing system, and it's had as much effect on our minds, civilization, institutions, culture, and so forth as the DNA has on our physiology. So we are children of that code too. And it's something that most of us are unconscious of. And so the children of the code has these two meanings. One is that we're all children of the code in the way I just said, in that our civilization, culture, institutions of civilization have been so profoundly affected by this. But also because our consciousness has been so profoundly affected by this. Now, I'm not going to have time to go into much of that. But I recommend you, to the extent that you're interested in any of this, to go to my website. On it, there's 50 online video clips now, and about 4,000 pages of interviews with scientists and scholars that cover the spectrum from the beginnings of writing to the implications of processing code to the development of our brains. So, and everything pretty much in between. The other meaning of Children of the Code, which is really critical and important, and the one that most passions me, is that about 100 million people in this country are living lives somewhere between seriously and significantly diminished, constrained, warped, because they were unable to break through to transparency in processing this code. So on the one hand, all of us are children of it, and in another very special and unique way, some children never get through it. Never get through it to the point where writing is as transparent to meaning and language as speaking and listening is. The backdrop of Children of the Code for me, and the kind of the core purpose of this, is not so much about reading, which might seem a little strange given the the title of our project and some aspects of its focus. But our real purpose is what we call stewarding the health of our children's learning. I've talked to, as Block mentioned, over 100 experts, actually about 120. We've had 400 hours of conversations with people ranging from the #1 educational scientist in the United States government to researchers working on every dimension of brain processing relative to the stream of consciousness, relative to the way that abstract thinking and reflection and what have you function. And there isn't anybody that can ever, we've asked the question, what's more important than stewarding the health of our children's learning? What educational mission or objective is more important than that? Nobody can get on top of it. There's no way to trump it. And that's an entirely different objective than an objective that's content specific. Right? It's basically saying that there's nothing more important than how well our children learn from the inside out, to participate healthily in learning, as if learning is the primary central dynamic of which human beings become human. So I want to move into the reading conversation, but before I do, I want to close on this and just say, what aspect of your own life, think about that for a second, what aspect of your personal life hasn't been profoundly affected, transformed, shaped by your learning? Anybody? Anything? How many children do you think would, I've asked this to thousands of kids across the country. I ask them, do you think that your teachers and your parents are more concerned with how healthy you're able to learn, how well you're participating, how well you're learning, or what you're being taught? Never had one kid say how well they were learning. Never one. The system's backwards. The system's backwards. So whether you look at it individually in terms of how is it that we are physically healthy, emotionally healthy, cognitively healthy, linguistically healthy, how well we learn to play with others and communicate with others and get along with each other, how well we achieve in school, how well we achieve on the job, how well, any vector, any dimension of human existence, and it comes down to how well we learn. And yet, that's not what our education system's organized around, principles organized around. So that's our first objective, imagine that our primary objective in education is to steward the health of learning. So then we ask the question, well, what is it that's gumming up the learning? What is it that's damaging, harming, endangering the quality of learning? That leads to the conversation about literacy. One of the big distinctions that's also kind of missing in education that we pivot on, and that takes us into the conversation about reading, is the distinction between natural and artificial modes of learning. Right? I mean, little children come in born, wired, oriented to learn their way into being more fully, extensively present in the world that they inhabit, in the world that they're born into. But they're not wired up to deal with the forms of artificial confusion that the culture has developed over the past couple thousand years. And for the most part, we don't help them through it. That's the backdrop for understanding the story of the relationship between learning and this code. And again, we don't have time. When I travel around on events, doing events like this, I carry with me 90 video segments that if I played them end to end would take 6 hours. And then I talk on top of that, so it would take 9 or 10 hours to go through the whole thing. So I'm going to give you a very high-speed, treetop view of what I think are some of the most important pieces. So in the Children of the Code project, we break it into a series of sub-modules, one having to do with the dimensions of the problem, the reading crisis itself, why reading is important, the modes of academic danger children are in that have struggled with reading, the emotional danger, which is one of our biggest concerns, how all of that translates into social danger and social pathology, what the collective costs that represents in terms of costs to our democracy, our economy, our healthcare system. I mean, it's unbelievable how this radiates to the extent that we consider it kind of the national learning disability. More children's learning is crippled and disabled by what happens to them in the course of learning to read than by any other thing we keep track of. All of which leads us to the need for a reframe, a complete rethinking of what reading is and how to bring children up through it. I'll come back and maybe show little bits of this. With a backdrop of the dimensions of the problem, but by the way, each of these little things I'm stopping by is a little mini documentary that under more circumstances I would play for you. So here we look at the causes and contributing factors. Why is it? How could it be that 100 million American adults and children are living lives mangled by the fact that they didn't break through to transparency with reading? Given that it costs us more than the war on crime, drugs, terror combined, given that it's actually fundamentally and profoundly learning disabled to those that struggle with it for too long, how could it be that we'd have this problem? So we deconstruct all the different dimensions that are associated with the challenges of learning to read, from innate wiring differences in the way that the brains come in, and differences in the kind of genetic neurobiological substructure that children come with, to parental environments, particularly the intergenerational transmission of difficulty that parents had when they were growing up, and how they therefore model an environment that replicates it in their children. Preschools, how preschools up until very recently have had the sense that it was developmentally inappropriate to try to prepare kids for reading. They've only just begun to switch gears on that. And as a consequence, the way we look at this whole thing is as if the moment a child is born, they've got a date with destiny. Somewhere 5, 6 years down the road, there's an obstacle course wall called the code. And if their early life learning trajectory doesn't prepare them for that, they're going to hit that thing and their entire life is going to be misshaped by it. Right? So up until recently, the way that preschools worked was, well, it's not our business to do that. We don't think kids are developmentally ready. Now the arguments are starting to get finally to a point where it says, it doesn't matter about developmentally ready. Unless we're going to delay when we start teaching reading, we got to start getting them ready for reading right away. Otherwise, we're kind of criminally negligent in what's happening in their lives. Another big thing is exposure, the degree to which kids are exposed to different print and reading practices in the home. Of course, this huge thing, the non-English, the degree to which their family language environment is actually not speaking English either as a language as a whole or as a dialect, such that the reading materials that they encounter in school, there's this big disconnect that they can't reconcile. One of my favorite has to do with media. Almost everybody in this room, when we were growing up, if we wanted to have some intellectual stimulation and escape the particular little bubble that we were growing in, the primary gateway to do that was by learning to read. Today, a child born They got 500 cable channels, they got iPods, they got video games, they got personal computers. None of those things require anywhere near the frustrating pain and strain of learning to read. So there's immediate gratification on incredibly intellectually stimulating venues that are available to them. The other thing that I think is really important relative to media that also connects to this point is that this media is able to speak to them. They're able to enjoy this at a level that's consistent with their intellectual verbal development, right? I mean, if you ever listen to 5- and 6-year-olds talking to one another, listen to the level of complexity, detail, language, vocabulary, the intensity of the conversation, and then read what a 5-year-old's book has to say, I come away and say, like, who would want to read that? Who would want to read that junk? I mean, if you listen to the complexity of language that they've got at the oral language, why would they want to go through all that work to learn how to read that moronic stuff when all around them is surrounded this intellectually rich environment? There's so many things, is my point, working against children today, taking off in this. Even though it's more critical than it's ever been, it's in some respects more difficult than it's ever been. I'm going to, just as a tease to play one of my little videos here for you, I'll show you one of the other dimensions of what causes this difficulty, one of my favorites.
We seem to go back and forth between the pole of we shouldn't teach the code, or we should teach it, but teach it in this super simple way that doesn't actually work and hasn't worked in English for 500 years.
There's the born-again phonics people. There's the reborn-again whole language people. And they're actually more like cults than religions.
Is why do people dichotomize phonics and whole language? Why do they?
Anyway, each one of these things goes on and to more than we have in our whole time here. But in addition to these problems of the things that are happening to children as they're growing up that are preparing them or not preparing them, there's a whole series of factors in terms of the relationship between gene expression and environment, the sensitive slope of early neuroplasticity in terms of what the brain is expecting, given that it's a human organism, to be bathed in as it's coming into the world. The relationship between affect and cognition, or between emotion and cognition, which is critical to understanding this. How all of that's part of undergirding the language infrastructure that reading will later sit on. So there's many variables involved here. One of the big problems that we have as adults that are facile readers is we just don't experience this at all like somebody who's struggling with it. So in addition to these kind of internal issues, we've got issues like what's called dysteachia or instructional malfeasance or instructional confusion, or kids that are instructional casualties, meaning that from the government's perspective, a great deal of the reason that children are having this trouble is primarily because the teachers don't know what they're doing. I don't agree with that. I see the problem as being something that starts with the early learning trajectory at birth, and that teachers are just trying to compensate for that trajectory and pull them up into the code. But the entire society is pretty ignorant about what's really going on with reading.
Many education reforms have taken place in the nation. We've had the education governors, we've had education presidents, we've done all of these things, and everybody's had a new solution. But in fact, the problem isn't getting better. The problem's getting worse.
We create a city the size of Chicago every 2.5 years, filled with kids who never finished high school, no-hopers, and pregnant teenagers, kids who are on drugs, push-outs as well as dropouts. City the size of Chicago every 2.5 years.
This is not the formula for a successful, ambitious, globally competitive adult population.
I think it's the nation's greatest challenge.
Anyway, again, all of this can go on and on and on. The heart of the issue that we're bringing attention to right now is that learning to read represents an unnatural and artificial form of confusion to the human brain. That's hard to imagine for all of us that are good at it. But if you look at what's involved, if you deconstruct the process of what's involved, what we're talking about really when we talk about reading is we're talking about a code informed and instructed simulation of language, produced, assembled, created, projected by the brain. It's no different than a modem. It's no different than a DVD player. It's just that it's happening inside our brain, and we began doing it so long ago that we forgot about doing it. But it is every bit as much a machine as anything that we use in the outside world. It is a symbol processing, virtual reality projection machine. It's just half of it's in our brain. And if this thing doesn't form right, here's the terrible thing. If this thing doesn't form right, by the time you're 4 or 5 years old, your life's messed up. So I'm going to play one of the longer videos and then close.
How do you feel when you read? My brain hurts. It hurts?
My brain is starting, my head started hurting. It's like it kept on boom, 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 just beating. I didn't even know the word. I don't even know what's going on in my head. I didn't. I was like, what is this word? I can't figure it out.
It's pretty difficult, like putting some sounds to these symbols, knowing the difference between one and another, and knowing that some are numbers and some are letters, and that you can put them together and they form a completely different thing.
I get confused a lot because I'll sit there and I get frustrated. It's no fun. I don't like reading.
I can't understand what it's saying.
We're talking about children experiencing a form of confusion that's unnatural to the organism.
I think that's an interesting and good way to frame things.
Learning to read in alphabetic orthography is a very artificial and unnatural act.
It's one of the most complex, unnatural, cognitive interactions that brain and environment have to coalesce together to produce. It's amazing.
Let's remember, for the vast bulk of our existence as a species, we lived without any formal system of writing.
In a sense, reading was invented by Gutenberg, or you could say it was invented by the Swedish kings that for the first time required that every child in the kingdom must learn to read, and left the local preacher, the local minister, responsible for that. And that's a 17th century event, right? That's a relatively recent event.
The alphabet is a technology in the sense that it's a contrived device for conveying information.
It is in a sense a technological artifact, absolutely.
When we read, we take in a code, we get a set of instructions, and we perform cognitive processes.
Well, in English, get the hook.
I knew the letter names. It was like the sounds and the bigger words and the words that, like, when you sign them out, they aren't pronounced the way they sound.
I mean, I'm sounding them out like I've been taught, but it just ain't, I don't know, it just don't work. Because, you know, they tell you to sound out, and then, you got vowels, and some of them are silent, and it's just like, well, these two work together to make this, and it's like, huh? I mean, it's just like, it's so confusing.
C, K, S, Ch, Sh. O, ow, ah, wa, oo. M, P, P. A, a, R, R, R. I, E. S, Sh, Z. O, ow, ah, wa, oo. N,
Inconsistencies, absurdities,
facts contrary to the etymology that show up in the writing system, it's a mess.
It's a real puzzle, and it's a very arbitrary exercise in orthography to figure out what's what.
Who came up with E-N-O-U-G-H spells enough?
Why do I have one tooth and several teeth, and I go into a restaurant and sit in one booth and there aren't several beef?
You know, oh, by F, I don't hear F making v sounds very often, and it doesn't. In fact, it only does it in of.
I don't know of anything that has more exceptions than reading in English. I mean, English seems to be a total monster.
I suspect that most letters that are in your sort of foveal zone, or the area right around your fixation, are probably being processed pretty much in parallel, so I don't think we need to think of them as, you know, one 25 milliseconds, another 25 milliseconds, but averaged over them, it's going to be about 25 milliseconds, yeah. Very fast, staggeringly fast.
Wish you had more time for that. I just kind of close that part by saying that imagine that you're standing in front of a moving conveyor belt that's moving by, with each object's moving by every 25 milliseconds or so, right? Which is so many of them, right? It's very fast. And each thing that's coming up may or may not fit, because any one letter may or may not work with a sound. So you're trying to figure out this puzzle at this phenomenal rate of so many, you know, somewhere between 10 and 20 different puzzle pieces per second, in order for the puzzle making of getting the code to work to generate an internal simulation of language that moves at the speed language moves at. And that's very critical. I'll give you a quick example. How are we doing on time? I realize that I don't know when we started, and I want to be respectful of our time constraints.
You're good. You've got about 20 minutes left if you want it.
Good. I do want it. Thank you. Anybody recognize that sound? Try it again. Recognize that? How about now? The point is that human intelligibility of language operates in a narrow temporal profile. The difference between bad and dad happens in a fraction of a second in the brain, soundscape. So reading has to actually generate this simulated language at the same speed that language operates at, or it's not intelligible, just like we can tell what the music was if it's too slow or too fast. So there's this narrow range the simulation's got to generate into. And its ability to do that depends upon it depends on an enormous number of factors. Primarily the emotional resilience of the child when they're first developing and growing up. It depends on the kind of language environment they've been in and to what degree it's exercised their capacities to make distinctions in sound at high speeds. And there's a great body of work, I'll jump to that briefly, called Meaningful Differences, that anybody who's in education should really be aware of, where a scientist and his team went into the home environments of children from the time that they were about 6 months old, and recorded every word that went back and forth between the infant and the family environment between 9 months and 4 years old, doing a sample of rotating through days of the week and all that stuff. So they had a scientifically valid sample of the language processing patterns in different families. They found that across the SES spectrum, there was a difference of about 35 million word exposure differences. Now, if you think of each word exposure as an exercise environment for the mind, linguistically, in terms of vocabulary building, in terms of differentiating sound, all of these things are opportunities that happen as children engage in language. So some kids coming from more taciturn family environments are hearing 13 million words or so cumulatively by the time they're 4 years old. Other kids are hearing like 50 million words. Well, guess what? As may be obvious, if you track those same children and just look at just their language variation, you can carry that right across into 3rd and 4th grade and see that that corresponds as high as data will allow with their Stanford Binet intelligence tests, their picture vocabulary tests, their overall success in taking off in reading. So there's this really strong correspondence between the early life learning trajectory and how well they take off later. So that backdrop is part of giving their brain the cognitive linguistic advantages that are necessary to punch through this code. You ever use your computer and recognize that if you try to get it to do too many things at once, it stutters? Right? It starts to stutter on you. The human brain's the same. It can only do so many things at once. And the faster it runs, the more it can do at once. Right? So anyway, this is another whole dimension. All of these videos are online on our website that we're not going to show you right now. But now I want to close with what I think is the most important piece in all this. I started in the beginning with the thing that drives us is not so much reading, but the health of learning. It's the health of learning that's really at stake here. And this is, by the way, why there's such a strong correspondence between low levels of reading proficiency and various social pathologies. It's been long known. I mean, if you look at the percentage of people in prison, it's like 85% are very low in literacy. Well, some people would go to argue, and the same thing, you could take any social pathology and you'll find this inordinately high correspondence. And one of the questions has always been, well, why is that there? Some would go to the more simple argument that say, well, that's there because they never learned to read, and because of that they couldn't get through education successfully. And there's certain truth to that, I don't deny. But I think the real issue goes much deeper, which is what happens to a child's mind when they develop a pre-conscious, faster than conscious, emotional aversion to confusion. What happens to their mind? What happens to their ability to learn when they've got a, faster than they're even aware of, emotional aversion to going near the confusion because of what it makes them feel like? It's learning disabling. It's profoundly, fundamentally learning disabling. So for those children that struggle too long with learning to read, what they're really learning is to develop a shame response. And this may seem hard to believe, so I'm going to take you through a couple of videos in our remaining time that help ground it.
When I was reading to my friend and I got stuck on a word, and then when it was at recess, I heard her talking, saying that like I can't read so good. It made me feel kind of scared that I'm not smart.
When kids are hesitant, disfluent, inaccurate, slow and labored in reading, that is very visible to the peers, and the peers, the other kids, again, look at reading as a proxy for intelligence. It doesn't matter if this kid is already a genius and can do algebra in the 2nd grade. Reading produces particular perceptions. Better said, lousy reading produces a perception of stupidity and dumbness to peers, and clearly to the youngster who is struggling. That is the shame.
And I don't like reading out loud. I get embarrassed.
Being asked to read out loud in front of a class, which is a very typical elementary school reading activity, can be a terribly humiliating situation.
My teacher asked me to come into the front of the class and read a book, and everybody was just staring at me, and I got real nervous because I didn't want to mess up or anything. And then when I started reading, I started messing up, and I just couldn't help it, and everybody started laughing at me and stuff. So,
like, the teacher would ask me to read something, and I would read it, and I'll get a wrong word, or I'll go too slow, and they'll make fun of me.
I kept messing up on the words, and people kept laughing at me.
They said that you don't know how to read. I bet you won't be able to how to read when you grow up.
They always laugh at me if I get twisted up with words. It makes my heart drop, because it seems like they're not my friend no more.
This is, I'll show one more. Would you give me a 10-minute alert? Sure. Okay. This isn't just an unfortunate side issue feeling. This is deep in how it affects the brain.
The other kids could make the books talk. They'd pick the books up and words would come out. He said, to me, it just looked like lines and circles and squiggles. I had no idea where the words were. The teacher began hassling me because I wasn't able to read. And by the end of October, the kids were making fun of me because I couldn't read. And I realized it wasn't going to be too long before my mom and dad found out that I wasn't doing my job. He said, so I was scared. I was really scared. He said, but I was also a real resourceful kid. And I looked around the room and I noticed there was another kid in the class who couldn't read. This kid couldn't read a lick. And yet nobody made fun of him because he couldn't read, and the teacher didn't hassle him because he couldn't read, because he was deaf. He wore a hearing aid. He had a hearing loss. And because he was deaf, no one expected him to read on time. He said, so I figured in my 6-year-old mind, the solution to my problem was to convince everyone that I was deaf. And if I could convince everyone I was deaf, they'd stop hassling me about the reading. He said, so I went on a one-man campaign to convince everyone in my life that I couldn't hear. He said, and everything was fine until June. I said, well, what happened in June, Dan? He said, my mom and dad sat me down the last day of school in June in the 1st grade and said, Dan, we're really worried about your hearing. You don't seem to be able to hear. We've taken you to hearing doctors and audiologists all over Cape Cod. Nobody can figure out what it is. So we've made an appointment for you. And you're going to go to Boston Children's Hospital next week. And you're going to stay there for 4 days and 3 nights. And they're going to do exploratory ear surgery and have your adenoid surgically removed. And this 6-year-old kid went through 3 days of surgery rather than tell his parents what he had done. Can you imagine the trauma of a 6-year-old child going through surgery that only he knows he didn't need?
Shame and avoiding embarrassment are at the heart of almost every story we get from adults who come into adult literacy programs.
I mean, I've talked to 50 kids about this. And to ground this in your own experience, if we're honest with ourselves, we all feel shame. If we pay attention to what happens when we feel shame, we'll see, honestly, that what it does is divert our attention away from whatever's causing the shame. So what happens when we feel ashamed of learning? What happens to our learning? That's what's going on. We're talking about a significant dimension of our population who is underneath the reading challenge, learning to feel shame in relation to learning, and it's learning disabling. And that's why we have these negative trajectories in relation to the way that reading and school success in general works. Not to diminish the fact that reading has this utility value as an information acquisition portal, but it's got a deeper meaning with respect to the health of learning in general. We call this the downward spiral of shame. It starts off with ambiguity overwhelm, this confusion, this puzzle processing I was talking about before, this high-speed virtual reality assembly that has to happen in the mind, and this decoding. Decoding is actually a misleading term. It's really disambiguation, right? Getting rid of the confused correspondence, collapsing the probabilistic, the possible wave to an actual configuration. So it's not decoding. In decoding, it's a simple. You take this part of the code, you translate it to that, you know. Modems don't have any confusion like reading, you know. So ambiguity overwhelm. The child's confused and they're overwhelmed by that. That leads to a stutter in the flow of reading. That brings about a self-consciousness. As they become self-conscious, they remember, oh yeah, they feel shame. The number one thing that happens to children that have difficulty, and I wish, again, that we had time to go into the videos for this, is they feel at fault. That's what we're doing. We've created a context, unintentional conspiracy that involves parents, teachers, everybody in society, so that when children struggle with this, they don't think it's the fact that their parents didn't talk to them enough. They don't think it's the fact that their teachers didn't know what they were doing. They don't think it's because a 15th century king and his handful of scribes didn't know what they were doing when they assembled written English. They don't have any sense of any of that. The only thing they know is something's wrong with them. So every time this confusion happens, it triggers a blame and a shame. And that gets more and more intense. And when it does trigger, just like if you're paying attention to something and something else pops into your mind, it diminishes your brain's ability to do what you were doing in the first place, right? So when the shame kicks, it not only hurts them, it diminishes their ability to work on the problem that they were working on to begin with respect to reading. So this downward spiral ensues. They disentrain from the ability to stay in it. They drop out of the flow of reading. This is very frustrating. The more frustrating it is, the more they blame themselves for it. The more they blame themselves for it, the easier it is to go to shame. The more shame they experience, the more they want to avoid it. That precipitates a self-image. And what you find with kids that are going through this is that what they do is they come up with a self-identity that says, I'm stupid, I'm not smart, I'll never get this, it's not my thing, I'm not an intellectual person. All kinds of self-descriptive labels which protect them from the shame they'd feel if they didn't have those labels. So they avoid reading, it never gets better, and the spiral goes on. And you can see a massive part of our population. If you go back to the stats, 88% of African American 4th grade children in this country are below proficiency with reading. 88%. 64% of all 12th graders. Those are federal stats. You could argue them. You could get into the debate as to whether or not we should discount them by 20 or 30% because the feds have... But anyway you look at it, it's a huge and substantial number. And what it means is for those children that are below proficiency, that means that the whole reading interface is gumming up, exacerbating, making more difficult every other dimension of school. So we're talking about most of our children, to one degree or another, severe to at least significant, are suffering a warped educational trajectory because they didn't break through to transparency through this code because of our general and collective ignorance. And it's affecting the core of their emotional well-being, the health of their learning. We don't have time to go into all the brain stuff. I'm going to close with this one more little piece, probably somebody that you recognize. This is our kind of big view of the whole process where a child's born, they embark on a kind of early life learning trajectory through the family learning space, which is itself incredibly influenced by the level of literacy of the parent. The level of literacy of the parent affects their parenting knowledge, affects the degree to which they're involved, the parental vocabulary, all of which is the environment the child's passing through on their way to instruction. Depending upon how strong this is on many dimensions, both the linguistic and cognitive exercise dimensions we spoke of, but also the emotional. In order to break through the confusing code barrier, children have to have enormous emotional resilience to not, when they hit the frustration, to not shame out, to not want to escape, to protect themselves from the bad feeling. So their early childhood experience, both in terms of emotional resilience and cognitive linguistic foundations, are critical. To the extent that they come in the right way and the teaching is really good, they experience what's called Matthew effects, and they start to bootstrap and spiral into ever more positive experience, and it becomes ever easier, and off they go. And it's just background, transparent, invisible, automatic like it is for us. For children that don't hit the trajectory just right, it's frustrating, it's shaming. The more that it's frustrating and the more that it's shaming, the less that it works well. The less that it works well, the less they want to do it. And on goes the downward spiral. And that starts to be a trajectory that's at the center of what happens to them in life.
I do see some very interesting ripple effects when kids are not acquiring reading skills. For example, it might be that a particular child in 4th grade is having difficulty keeping pace with reading comprehension or with decoding. And because he's having trouble with reading, he hates to read. And when he does read, he gets almost nothing out of it because he's reading very passively. And because he's reading very passively, he's not able to use reading as a way of building his language abilities. So what oddly happens is that his language problems caused his reading problems, and his reading problems are now causing much more aggravated language problems. Those language problems, in turn, are going to make it hard for him to follow directions, communicate well with other people, and even use language inside his mind for something called verbal mediation. Verbal mediation is the process through which you regulate your behavior and feelings by talking to yourself. And believe it or not, a lot of kids with language problems really don't use language as a way of regulating themselves. What does that mean? That means they're much more vulnerable if someone offers them cocaine to take that cocaine, to get in trouble, to get depressed, because they don't have a voice inside that says, yeah, I could take that medicine, I could take that drug from that kid, and he'd think I'm a cool dude. But, oh, if I take it, I could wreck my brain, and I could get addicted, and my mother would kill me if she finds out, and I could get arrested. And all of that comes out of language, that sort of verbal conscience that's guiding you. So if you go all the way back to the language problem and say, yeah, it's causing a reading problem, and the reading problem is causing a language problem, and the language problem is causing a behavior problem, and the fact that this kid can't read and other people around him can read much better is eroding his self-esteem, making him feel pretty worthless.
So we're pretty much out of time. I would just close by saying that there's a lot that can be done about this, but it all begins by understanding it differently. Our purpose in existence with the Children of the Code project is to resource first-person learning, meaning that we want to work with teachers and parents and people who really care about this, who see what's going on with this, and who want to learn for themselves, not because they're following some protocol, like a robotic conscript, that they don't understand, but that they actually want to understand and learn how to connect with children on the stuttering, struggling edge of this and be radically more effective in helping them. But we don't have time to go into all of that side of it. What I really wanted to do today was just share with you this kind of different view of the importance of thinking differently about reading. Stop taking it for granted. Okay. So we've got time to talk Q&A now, right?
My point of view, being involved in reading for the last 30, 40 years. The good news and the bad news. Bad news, I'd like to translate that into numbers. The average kid who drops out of school, and it's usually, most commonly because they can't read in third and fourth. They don't drop out in high school, they drop out in third and fourth grade. So if you take the income difference between a high school dropout, it's about $15,000 a year, and a community college graduate, where everybody should be going to today to survive, about $30-some thousand. So about $20,000 a year times 50 years of lifespan. So you're talking about $1 million. We're depriving each individual who drops out of high school about $1 million lifetime income. That's what we're all doing. So you multiply 1 million times 1 million dropouts a year. What is that? Not a billion, it's a trillion. We're losing in the economy $1 trillion a year, plus all the emotional, psychological. You're breaking them. You're crippling them for life. So this is a serious problem.
There's an interview on our site that backs up what you're saying with James Heckman, who's a Nobel Prize winner for economics in 2000, who wrote a study called The Productivity Argument for Investing in Young Children. Arthur Rolnick, a member of the Fed board, is also on board on that economics team, studying purely the economic implications of this kind of crash and burn that's happening in early education.
So the good news from our point of view is in the city of Los Angeles, with 1,000 elementary schools, they happen to be using the Open Core program, of course.
Plug.
They, in the last 7 or 8 years, have eliminated the kids below basic. Now they all are proficient, but those are the hard-to-reach kids. They don't speak English. Many of them don't speak English at home. They're poor, and they have all the other problems that they have in all the other metropolitan centers. And in terms of the 3 and 4-year-old, 1 and 2 and 3 and 4-year-olds, from our point of view, I think we can do more than reach out and read. And Sharon and Jay McCracken, and we're trying to get together to have a local system to reach every kid like they do in Kalamazoo. Every single kid when they're 1 and 2 and 3 years old, through the pediatricians. So we're gonna. It's a really exciting program, right?
Yes, it is.
Really, really fun. Jay's really excited about it. And his teachers are too. So we're going to try to do something local.
I just wanted to say one thing about many years ago. I was a young teacher, and I started out with 2nd graders. And of course, being the new kid on the block, I had the low class, because they do that to young teachers. And one day I said to the kids, "What do you hear most? What's the phrase you hear most?" Because things were playing in my head. I think everybody has things that play in their head from what their parents said to them, right? And so I said, and I was expecting, take out the trash, clean your room, I love you, whatever. And overwhelmingly, these 2nd graders said they heard most at home, "Can't you do anything right?" And, of course, second graders, they were the low readers. They were the emotionally, they were played down too much.
The Hart-Risley study that we touched on.
Questions, we have this incredible resource here. The guys are interviewed all these people. So please.
Well, I think your point is really well taken in that the studies that have been done on family language patterns indicate that the big difference in volume is also a difference in its emotional positivity, exactly at the level you're talking about. All kids get instructions. All kids get told what to do, and they don't like that. What's different is that the kids that are getting talked to more are getting a much higher ratio of positive talk engagement, and that affects what would be their first response to your question. Also, just to close on that point, I think the most important misunderstood critical learning environment of early childhood is their own self-talk. They're talking to themselves all the time. That's their primary learning environment in a way. How that forms, what they're saying to themselves. One of my favorite things to do with kids is to ask them, do you hear that voice inside? The first response is they're not sure they should even talk about it, which goes to show you how weird that feels for them. And secondly, then who's saying what to them? Just like you. Okay, so yes.
My question is there a socio-economic pattern to this as well as a rural versus
There's
urban?
a correspondence between socioeconomic status and taciturnness versus talkativeness.
Okay.
But if you, in the research that was done, if you look at the high income parents who talked little and the poor parents who talked a lot, it indicates that it's talk, not SES, that's the driver.
So what about, is there a difference between rural environment versus urban? And with this, I mean, is this having, obviously you said it's having an effect on the larger educational experience for children, but is it affecting things like writing and mathematics, which is also a code, in
Absolutely.
huge ways?
The difference between writing, spelling, mathematics, and reading is the time the brain has to work through it, right? I mean, I can volitionally think about how to spell something. I can volitionally think about how to solve a math problem. I can think about how to write something. I can't stop and think about how to construct a word when I'm reading, or it all blows up.
So once this damage is done to a child in many ways, does that mean that it's exponentially harder to fix it the older the child gets?
Yes, that's what yes, it's not impossible, but the amount of neurological efficiency, the quality, the neurological efficiency necessary to change trajectory gets harder and harder as you go further and further downstream from the optimal sensitive windows. So children's early language, there's been studies that show how parents talk to babies at 9 months old already establishes the pattern and slope of their vocabulary acquisition at 3. Right? So from the beginning, they're developing a pattern, a trajectory into language that's dependent upon the language environment that they're growing up in. And yeah, I mean, there's a number of good neuroscience studies that show that using neuroplasticity techniques of getting right on the edge of where the stretch edge of the brain is in terms of its functional processing capabilities, you can exercise that efficiently and kind of make up. But the way that we function in schools, preschools, and in the average household, it's radically insufficiently efficient to make up for a big gap.
And that was really my question too, is sort of, we know early childhood education is key, you know, and all the things you've been talking about in terms of the family environment and so forth, but what do you do with kids who are, you know, in 5th, 6th grade? I mean, do we just say that it's hopeless?
No, not at all, not at all.
But I wonder, like, even with the open course system, if you don't start, you know, right at the beginning, is there a way to kind of, in a remedial way, address that and catch up, or?
Well, my response is that once you get to 5th, 6th grade and you're dealing with a struggling reader, you know, you're dealing with their unconscious emotional aversion, stuttering up their underlying cognitive linguistic processing. If you don't deal with that, trying to work them on the reading thing is just, you're pushing them out in the wrong way. I mean, it's just not going to work. There's a series of things that we recommend. First of all is reframe the shame. We've got to get them to remember, they've grown up thinking this is a reflection of them, and they're afraid of it, they're ashamed of it, they don't want to talk about it, they don't want to even acknowledge it to themselves, let alone to you. So we've got to change that emotional context that they're experiencing themselves in. Then we got to sync up with them, meaning that right now we tend to throw these models at them to exercise them in this kind of probabilistic way according to what seems to, in our almost Renaissance cannon fire analysis process, seems to be working, what intervention seems to be working for somebody in that rough profile. But that's way off sync with what's actually happening to an individual child. We've got to develop tools, and that's one of the things that we're working on, that will allow a teacher or a supporter to get right on the edge of the stutter in real time when it's happening in a way that's analogous to the way neuroplastic remediation works. So it gets right there with them on the edge that they're having trouble with and cues and feeds back to them so they can progress more efficiently at the core of this, which is entirely different, you get me, than just kind of putting them through the protocols.
In the Waldorf schools, they have this delayed
Right.
learning to read. What's the impact of that in terms of
Well, you could argue that if all schools waited till they were 7 or 8, kids would be better, right? Because they'd have more potential language experience if we worked on oral language earlier. There's no question that when we begin to teach reading is what establishes when this obstacle course wall shows up in the life of children. So we're almost having to work to compensate for our instructional convenient decision about when to begin the instruction of reading. Now, you could take another question, another angle into that, which is, should we, the longer we wait, the more potentially self-conscious children are, right? They become more self-conscious as they grow. So if we wait until kids are 7 or 8 and they're ill-prepared, they're liable to have a shorter shame-out cycle than they would if you do it when they're 5 or 6. So there's a lot of pros and cons here. Ultimately, any generalization about when to teach reading is just that, a generalization. Right? And so it's a generalization that's made for the convenience of the institution, not for what's effective or efficient for any given child. But yet, in the practical world, we have to do that. Right?
I think that the confusion that you mentioned is so great because adults give them so many different methods.
Yes.
In my lifetime, we had the look-say, we had the whole language, we had all different kinds of methods. And if one kid learns partly how to read, and then somebody else comes in with a new method.
Yeah, next year it's a different teacher, different attitude, different method.
The greed of all these companies who publish different methods, and they push them to the schools. And all the different methods that I used, I have had a little insight with our publishing company. So I wonder, what can one do to make it clear to the general public that it's this confusion?
Well, that's what our focus is. If you looked at the center of our causes and contributing factors, at the very center of it's confusion, because we put that at the center of this. It's an unnatural, artificial form of confusion that, depending upon all these variables, a child may or may not be ready for, and that instruction has to differentiate their readiness with in order for it to be effective. We're engaged in what we call a social education reform project. We're not selling anything. You go on our site, there's nowhere to go you can buy anything, nothing. You go on our site and look around for how should I teach reading, there's nowhere on there that says you do this, this, this. We're trying to do what you just suggested, which is to draw the conversation down to a deeper place that can't be dismissed because of sales agendas and methodological wars, by calling people into learning about this deeper. My sense is that anybody who's willing to do it, who can actually pay attention to a child right when they're stuttering, who can learn to read what's going on inside a struggling reader, this becomes very obvious what's going on and what to do about it. But we tend to, for the same reason we elected to put reading instruction in kindergarten and first grade, we tend to generalize around what's institutionally convenient, right? Which I'm not trying to say we don't have to do that. Of course we've got to. But I think the ground of how to apply institutional convenience is going to come best when teachers and parents actually have a deeper first-person understanding of these challenges, rather than these superficial, simplistic models that are really, this is virtual reality. This is a complex piece of artificial technology that's grown in our brains under the right conditions.
I keep thinking of
text messaging now. That
the conventions.
It's something to make light of, but I'm noticing with my teenage daughter types.
Right.
Yeah, these kids, some who can't write a sentence, can text all day long and quite vividly and quite good.
It's an unambiguous code.
Yeah.
There's one of the people we interviewed wrote a book called From Alphabet to Email, studied the text and instant messaging behavior of college and high school students. The problem is that we're never going to use that as a mechanism of teaching kindergartners. So it may be that yes, teenagers get some reprieve from all of this, and that a new system starts to evolve for them that's more efficient, but it's not going to stop this first hit gauntlet that little kids are going through any more than 200 years of spelling reforms. I mean, one of my favorite stories is the story of Ben Franklin, Noah Webster, Charles Darwin, Lord Tennyson, Mark Twain, Theodore Roosevelt, and all of the giants who said, there's something wrong here, let's fix the code. And they all got shot down as idiots for even thinking they could do that. Right? So we're not going to change what's going on in the front end. We got to think about it differently.
Oh, plus in the world now, there's with young kids, like what David's saying, there's so much slang and abbreviation used in email and in instant messaging that if the average person older than most kids reads it, they don't even know what the heck they're talking
about. Yeah, no, I have to
I mean, I'm serious. I don't know.
I have an instant message pipeline with my 14-year-old, wherever she is, right? And so when I have a problem, I just ask her. So I understand what you're saying.
Did your research find anything about or any distinction about the relationship of parents or home talk to the child and their comfort level or experience with imaginative conversation?
Well, I think that's what the Hart Risley, the distinction they made was between business talk and turn taking. Imaginative, you might say, is another attribute of the non-business talk that's monitored in homes. I don't know that there's ever been a study that looked at language patterns in the homes and that specifically delineated and attributed some of it as imaginative per se. What they did say is that there's some language which is terminal, meaning I tell you to clean up after yourself, brush your teeth, do your homework, there's all this kind of instructional command stuff. And then the other mode of language is this turn-taking, invitation to continue to travel together more deeply in any number of conversation spaces. That's the big distinction. That actually corresponds, if you look at Allington's work on what makes good teachers. It's not that they're pumping up self-esteem or that they're knowledge experts or that they're got higher degrees. What seems to make the big difference in teachers is whether they're engaging students in modalities that inspire and support turn-taking that travels deeper into learning about whatever they're talking about, rather than giving them an answer that terminates the ongoing dialogue. So it's all about dialogue.
Because one of the things that I have found is a major difference as students are in junior or senior year of high school, and their abilities to deal with ambiguity, and their abilities or inabilities to see nuances. And I mean, this figures rather strongly whether even you're dealing with science or math, as well as with literature and the humanities.
Sure, but when you talk about that, when you say it that way, I mean, what we're talking about those are various descriptions on the confusion, right? I mean, something's that big.
Inability to tolerate.
A low frustration tolerance for confusion is learning disabling. Yeah.
But this can even occur in students who would not be considered challenged readers.
Yeah, that's because of the shallowness of our instrumentation, though. Because I think that we tend to think of readers as, well, they can read or they can't read. But the reality is it's this huge curve, and that somebody may break through to a point where instrumentally they can read, but they've come through it with such scars that it's still learning disabling to them, and in a number of ways. They will not read unless they have to. They will not feel good about themselves as an intellectual being and stray off into more complex and ambiguous circumstances. And even though, and I would suggest that that's a consequence of how they've learned to feel about the infrastructure that formed along the corridor of learning to read.
And even they might consider themselves good readers, and they might have test scores that would support their notion of themselves as good readers. But they cannot deal in reading or in interactions with ambiguity.
Yeah.
I mean, it's
yeah.
And some of it seems to be, in many, some instances, connected with certain ethnicities. For example, I find African Americans, by and large, seem to have more difficulty with this.
Again, the studies that have been done have shown that, yes, there's a greater correspondence between African Americans and difficulty in this space. But if you go down to the level of looking at their language foundations, it's actually the language, not the race, that's causal in the way the studies show. So it's not...
Well, no, I wasn't suggesting that. I was suggesting the culture.
I just had a comment. Your assertion about the early self-talk and that kind of thing. It's interesting that in the developing embryo, the first two structures to develop are a brain and a spinal cord, or a notochord. The very next structure to develop at 8.5 weeks is an auditory meatus. They start listening.
Yeah,
early.
yeah. I mean, that is the, I mean, some of the most interesting work we've encountered is the neuroscience of language, the deep neuroscience of language, how the brain learns. I mean, from the otherwise malformed structure of our teeth and jaw and tongue that has been kind of rammed evolutionarily to be adapted for rapid articulate speech. I mean, what most defines us is language and participating and learning together through language. So.
I have one quick question.
Thank you.
Is this, one is, how are educators and institutions reacting to this kind of information? Are they accepting it, or are they is there a stonewall from them? And the other is this problem occurring in other countries across the world that, whether it be an economic reason or an actual language structure issue as well in other places?
There's a person that we interviewed named Dr. Marquita Caravellis in England who's done the most research on international comparisons of reading. Unfortunately, we don't have any good metrics for cross-comparing reading in different countries because we can't index against the differences in orthographic depth as in the way that the language as a whole works and the hours of instruction that a child's getting. There's too many variables, so we can make only really gross comparisons. However, what we can say is what we call dyslexia is highest in the languages where there's the greatest orthographic depth, meaning where there's the least correspondence between letter and sound. The more confusion there is, the more reading problems there are. So English is number one, and then you get French and so forth, and it kind of goes down the line. And you can look at that. You look at the original Latin language distributed around by Rome, and then Rome's decay, and then the pickup of the Latin system as the primary writing system in different parts of Europe, and then how that got adapted to the local language. That left the kind of beginning foundations of all the writing systems of Europe, and some of them went on to fix them and clean them up and tune them up, and some of them didn't, and you can see the reading just distribute across that.
Now what about what about the institutions and what is their
We've done like 60 of these. It goes from working with school psychologists last week or whatever it was in Nebraska, state school psychologists, to superintendents, to neuroscientists, to juvenile justice workers, to reading teachers, right? So we're trying to talk to different groups around. We are slow, sure, making progress, snowballing. Our videos now, there's 50 of these online. I've showed you 2 or 3 here today. And they're being embedded in college and university courses by professors. So this is a long process, lifetime job, right, to shift the trajectory here. But so far it feels pretty good, like we're really getting traction.
Very interesting.
Yeah, we can use all the help we can get, so tell people about us, that'll help. I think I've over-traveled time, yeah?
No, you're just right on time.
How about that? Okay.